Hello everyone, and good morning. My name is Oyuki Iniguez, here with Group 3 News, and today we will be discussing hyperinflation in Venezuela. Protests in Venezuela have been ongoing since 2014, as the situation in the nation has only gotten worse. The country is plagued with the highest hyperinflation in the world, with an inflation rate of 200,000%. Due to the country's ongoing socioeconomic and political crisis, many people have taken to the streets to protest against the country's high levels of violence, inflation, and chronic shortages of basic goods and services. Poverty has become the standard in Venezuela, and people are trying to survive with only $20 a month. People can't afford food, and food stamps are just not enough. According to a recent survey, 61.2% of Venezuelans report going to bed hungry. Both the crime rate and the death rate have also been affected. As we can see, the rate has been increasing over the years, with the crime rate reaching 62% and the death rate is currently at 6.7 per 1,000 people in Venezuela. Due to the poor quality of life in Venezuela, many people have fled the country to seek better opportunities for themselves and for their children. However, many people don't want to leave their homes, but have lost all hope in their nation. Now, what led to Venezuela's hyperinflation? We will now talk to Ethan Hoppy to give us an insight as to how this crisis began.
Hello there. Many people believe that this started with Nicolas Maduro. But looking back at the previous presidency, we believe that many of these problems started with Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez was born to a middle-class family, and both of his parents were school teachers. He joined military school at age 17, and as he attended, he saw a lot of poverty and despair going around Caracas, and vowed to be a man of the left. He graduated in 1975, and a couple years later he founded the revolutionary movement within ranks called the People's Liberation Army to try to bring leftist ideals to the government. In 1982, he created a secretive cell in the Venezuelan army deemed the EBR 200, consisting of 200 people. He maintained that position while working as a teacher for the military school in which he graduated. And around a decade later, in 1992, Carlos Perez was elected as president and started following the IMF's policies. This angered a lot of people in Venezuela, and there were riots. This angered people enough to where Hugo Chavez and his EBR 200 staged a coup to overthrow the government. This failed, and 140 people died. But Hugo Chavez gave himself up and ordered his troops to lay down their weapons and surrender, and the media ate this up, and he became a star and a household name. He was in prison for 2 years before the new president, a friend of his, released him. After prison, he turned his mind to politics and started touring the nation spreading his Bolivarian ideals. He was critical of the president who released him and his liberal policies. Chavez said that those policies led to a drop in per capita income, coupled with increasing poverty and crime and gaps between emerging rulers and ruled, which favored the emergence of a populist leader. He ran for president in 1998 and won, only 6 years after being imprisoned. He enacted many social policies in his first presidency in order to give more power back to the people and put a lot of money into it. Some suspect that he's paid as much as $113 million into the country. He focused Venezuela's exports to be mainly oil, and his country became very oil dependent, with oil being roughly 90% of all exports. He nationalized privately owned oil fields into a state-owned oil and gas company, which he filled with top board members, which were close allies of his. He also started to take more and more. By 2007, oil in Venezuela was fully nationalized when he took assets from ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. During some protests over his nationalizing practices, in 2002, the army staged a coup and removed him from office for 2 days before putting him back into power. And after he doubled down on his nationalization policies, he gave a lot of people jobs. Hugo Chavez created a lot of jobs for his constituents through his nationally run programs, and unemployment started to decrease, as shown by the graph here. And as you can see, since the unemployment took a little jump during the 02-03 protests, but have gone down since. However, his public-run institutions were unsustainable due to lack of funding. He really put himself in the well with this one, because of the complete control over the economy, and with increasingly high inflation rates and a decrease in oil production, this country started running into some serious economic problems. In 2006, he introduced a new constitution that allowed him to run for 6-year presidential terms. In 2007, he introduced a referendum that would allow him to run for re-election indefinitely, and it failed. So a year later, he took control of the 2006, he introduced a new constitution that allowed him to run for 6-year presidential terms. In 2007, he introduced a referendum that would allow him to run for presidential. In 2006, he introduced a new constitution that would allow him to run for 6-year presidential terms. In 2007, he introduced a referendum that would allow him to run for president indefinitely, and it failed. So, a year later, he took control of the telecommunications, electricity, steel, and cement companies to go in hand with his oil company. He ran into a little trouble with inflation, but with it increasing as much as 20% in a few weeks. So, naturally, he introduced a new currency to the market, along with a brand new 12.5-cent coin. Yeah, that's right, a 12.5-cent coin to fix the inflation problems and the economy. All this did was confuse the market, but citizens loved it. And in 2009, they voted to put into place the amendment that would allow him to run as president indefinitely. In 2011, it was revealed that Chavez had cancer, and throughout the last couple of years of his presidency and his life, he made constant trips from Venezuela to Cuba, until he died in early 2013 in Cuba. Many of Venezuela's economic troubles began with Chavez and his misguided economic policies. Nationalized the whole country and gabbled their entire economy on oil, leaving it in a state of shambles. He left a government full of corrupt politicians, which have worsened their economic state. According to the World Bank, inflation rates have been at 370%, and they predict that it will increase to as much as 700%. There have been negative economic growth for years and a 40% drop in imports and exports. And there are large groups of people unhappy with the current living conditions. The life expectancy has decreased along with the total population, and many people want the current president, Nicolas Maduro, to resign. But with more on the subject, we have Theodosia Locke to inform us on the current presidency.
Thank you, Ethan, for the background information on the Chavez presidency. After Chavez's death on March 5, 2013, a special election for presidency was held and Vice President Nicolas Maduro became the president of Venezuela on April 19, 2013. After Maduro became president, he granted the military control over many industries in Venezuela. This is a problem because now there's nobody regulating the government and the industry. Maduro also printed money to distribute to citizens who were loyal to him. These two acts worsened the crisis, but Maduro was able to retain power. During the Chavez presidency, the oil price surged and Chavez used the profits to fund social welfare programs for the poor. He subsidized food, improved education system, built a healthcare system, and with this, he reduced poverty rate in half. But Maduro inherited a collapsing economy from Chavez. The welfare program became unstable when the oil price crashed in 2014, and Maduro failed to adjust. The Venezuela's GDP growth was at negative 17% in 2018. So how did Maduro stay in power? He replaced several Supreme Court justices with people who were loyal to him. In March 2016, the new Supreme Court ruled to strip the National Assembly from its power, which resulted in a massive protest in the country. The rule was reversed a few days later, but it was already too late. The protests continued to grow with thousands injured and hundreds of deaths and violence. Maduro decided to create a new National Assembly called the National Constituent Assembly, which will have the power to rewrite the Venezuela Constitution. Political opposition leaders boycotted the vote, but Maduro held the vote anyway and won the majority. The government claimed that 8 million Venezuelans voted, but experts say that only 3 million Venezuelans voted. The protests became deadly after this. The Maduro regime arrested political opposition leaders and shut down news websites, and they also detained journalists. Maduro also rigged the economy to stay in power. He used the currency system that was put together by Chavez, and it does not benefit the poor. In August 2017, Maduro set the official exchange rate to 10 bolivar to $1, but only the government officials, his friends, and allies have access to this exchange rate. So most Venezuelans get their US dollar from the black market at an exchange rate of 12,000 bolivar to $1. So the military profit from this exchange rate because they control most of the industries like agriculture and the oil industry. The military would import the supplies at the official currency rate and then sell the items to the black market to profit from the poor. This led to high poverty and hyperinflation. The people are starving and they cannot afford the basic necessities like food and medicine that was once subsidized. There's also shortage of supplies because the industry was nationalized during the Chavez presidency. Maduro refused to accept humanitarian aid as it would indicate that he acknowledged Venezuela is in an economic crisis. In 2018, Maduro was re-elected as president of Venezuela again, but other nations said it lacked legitimacy. In January 2019, the opposition leader of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, declared himself interim president, currently creating a power struggle in Venezuela. The United States, Colombia, Argentina, Spain, Germany, and other countries recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president, whereas Iran, China, Russia, Turkey, and Bolivia continue to recognize Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela. With two presidents and a divided state or country, there are uncertainty about the future of Venezuela, which forced young Venezuelans to leave the country to seek better opportunity to pursue their studies or have a better life. Approximately 3 million people left Venezuela by the end of 2018 and arrived in Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, and other nations. 13 nations in North and South America urged Maduro to hand over power to the Venezuela's National Assembly to stabilize the country. Venezuela is going through economic duress and battling hyperinflation. I will pass it to Enrico Papero to tell us more about Venezuela's hyperinflation.
With the term hyperinflation, we describe a very high and typically accelerating inflation. It makes quickly decrease the real value of the local currency while the prices of all goods increase. Hyperinflation sees a rapid and also continuing increase in nominal prices, and also in the nominal cost of goods and in the supply of money. Typically, however, the general price level rises even more rapidly than the money supply, as people try to get rid of the devaluing currencies as quick as possible. As this happens, the real stock of money, that is the amount of circulating money divided by the price level, decreases considerably. But what are the causes of the Venezuelan hyperinflation? So in 2013, the value of the Venezuelan currency, the bolivar, and also the prosperity of the Venezuelan economy as a whole was highly dependent on oil exports. More than 90% of the country export earnings came from oil, actually. So basically what happened is that in 2014, the global price of oil dropped. That means that the foreign demand of the bolivar to buy Venezuelan oil basically crashed. And as the currency value fell, of course, the cost of imported goods rose. And the Venezuelan economy went into a little bit of a crisis. The solution of Venezuelan new president Nicolas Maduro, who succeeded Chavez in March 2013, was to print more money. That might seem a little bit silly, but it can actually keep the economy moving while it gets over a hump caused by a short-term price shock. So the Venezuelan crisis, however, just got worse as the oil price continued to fall, compounded also by other factors that reduced Venezuelan oil output. As this happened, also international investors began looking elsewhere, driving value of the bolivar even lower. In these conditions, printing more money simply made the problem even worse. So it added to the supply of currency, so pushing the value down even further. And as the price rose, the government printed more money to pay its bills. So this vicious circle is actually what caused hyperinflation in Venezuela. Circumstances like that quickly make savings money in the local currencies basically nonsensical. So to protect themselves, Venezuelans started to convert their savings into a more stable currencies, like for example the US dollar. And this behavior lowered the value of the bolivar even further. As the crisis went on, an increasing number of ordinary Venezuelans began to engage in the unofficial currency market. Sometimes it took the form, for example, of taking subsidized Venezuelan goods like food, for example, across the border to sell. This earned the seller foreign currencies, but it also exacerbated shortages of goods within the country, and this effect drove the prices up even more. The government tried to get rid of this situation by basically issuing a new currency. So Maduro devalued the bolivar by 95%, which, by the way, is the largest and also greatest currency devaluation in contemporary world history. And he also tied the new currency to the price of oil. This was like an economic experiment designed to show the Venezuelan economy has solid foundation, but by now it didn't work as expected. As a final consideration, I can say that hyperinflation is a very difficult hole of which to climb. So very few economies have actually experienced this phenomenon, and it's really hard to stop it without a massive cut of governor spending.
Everyone, this is Sal Rao reporting from Group 3 News, and I'd like to talk a little about how Venezuela could solve the hyperinflation problem they're facing currently. There is no magic bullet for curing Venezuela's hyperinflation. Although over the past several years, Nicolas Maduro has flirted with the introduction of virtual currencies, slashed zeros from mind-blowing values, and implemented half-baked currency reforms, none of these attempts have even remotely solved the problem. Stopping hyperinflation is not simple. It requires institutional and political stability, which Venezuela currently does not have. After that, one option is to switch to dollars. Some countries that have battled hyperinflation have chosen to fully dollarize their economies once political and institutional stability have been restored. This is what Zimbabwe did after a severe hyperinflation in 2008. Full dollarization, however, has its drawbacks. When a country gives up its own currency to use the dollar, it forgoes the ability to conduct monetary policy, which can be a very important economic stabilization tool in the future. If the country is facing a recession, it would have been better served by loose and not tight monetary policy. Think of Greece in 2010 when it was unable to let its currency go to respond to the crisis it was facing because it no longer had control. To avoid the pitfall of full dollarization, Venezuela may have other options, and this is where Brazil's experience in 1994 may prove instructive. Brazil decided it would not dollarize, instead, it chose to reform its monetary system in a very broad and ingenious way, an initiative known as the Plano Real or the Real Plan. First, Brazil needed to find a solution to runaway fiscal deficit. Because the country had been struggling with hyperinflation for so long, politicians were amenable to proving deep fiscal reforms that would put an end to years of money printing to finance debts and deficits. And that was phase one of the real plan. Phase two was the creation of a virtual currency dubbed the URV, or also known as the Real Unit of Value. The URV was not an actual banknote, but a unit of account. From the time of its creation, all prices in stores, supermarket, and so on were required to list prices in URV. However, since there was no actual URV in circulation, people would pay for goods by converting URVs into their holding of the previous currency. Once enough confidence in the URV had been established, phase 3 of the real plan went into action, and the URV became the real, which is Brazil's currency to this day. The plan was a success, and inflation fell from monthly rates of 45% in March to April 1994 to just 2% in July, the month the real was launched. Inflation in Brazil has been mostly in single digit ever since. Could it be replicated in Venezuela? Possibly. To do so would require substantial international assistance in rebuilding institutions such as the Treasury and the Central Bank, as well as balance of payment support through external financing. Once these conditions are met and political stability have been minimally established, Brazil was far from politically stable in mid 1990s. Something like the Real Plan could perhaps address Venezuela's problem. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good day. Bye bye.
Thank you, Sahil. To conclude our report, the decline of oil price, social welfare spending, mismanagement, nationalization of industries, corruption, and hyperinflation contributed to the Venezuela crisis. Maduro should acknowledge the crisis and accept international assistance to rebuild Venezuela. Thank you.